All right, looks like it's a good time to start. Welcome everybody to Zoom. This is the second part of the Stormwater Victoria technical webinar regarding Healthy Waterways Strategy. I hope you're doing well and staying safe in this current climate. So I'm Tracy Pham. I'm the chair of the events subcommittee for Stormwater Victoria, and I'll be your MC for today. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional and paying respects to the traditional owners of the land, who are the Wurundjeri people. So this is, I would like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who have joined us today. Similar to last week, this session is being recorded. So if you have any concerns, please let us know. If you have any issues or questions, please send a private chat or message to Stormwater Victoria, where we will respond to those as soon as we can. If you have questions for speakers, feel free to ask them as we go along. Just pop your questions in the Q&A panel, which is in the Zoom toolbar below this video. So last week, we looked at an overview of the Healthy Waterways Strategy. That was presented by Trish and Sharon from Melbourne Water. And following on from that, we had Sigourney and Leon talking about updating the stormwater guidelines. A big question that we hear is, okay, so we have these ideas about reducing direct runoff and what we need to do, but how do we actually do it? And that's going to be the theme of today's webinar. We will be talking to Daniel Folkens and Georgie Wittenhall about their visions for implementing the Healthy Waterways Strategy to make it a successful strategy. Hopefully this will provide us some ideas and steps that we can take in the right direction and good discussion points for the stormwater industry. The webinar format this week is a little bit different. Last week, we found that question and answer time was cut short because of So we've moved a few things around this week. Next, I'll be handing it over to Jamie Tatum, who is the Stormwater Victoria President, and she will deliver the President's address. Then we will go to a 20-minute presentation by Daniel and his experience at the City of Casey. So pop those questions that are for him in the Q&A panel and let me know if you are directing those questions to him. We will then follow on with a 20-minute presentation by Georgie. And after those two presentations have been completed, we will do a Q&A session. Any remaining questions that have not been answered will be answered at a later date and sent out via email or a website post. Hopefully that will bring us to about 1:30, where I'll have some concluding remarks and future events that we've got lined up, and that will close the session. All right, so time to kick it off. Jamie.
Thanks, Trace. Hi, everyone. Really excited to see you all at the second part in this series. Another great turnout with some amazing speakers. As most of you are aware, this week is Reconciliation Week. And I think it's a great opportunity to reflect on the work we do for our waterways to reduce the impact and try to restore them to a time before settlement. When Indigenous Australians walked the land in harmony, they did so in a way that respected the land that gave them food and shelter. We cannot say the same for our historical leaders. However, it's refreshing to see the change as we step forward. One critical and dynamic step forward for our waterways that really showed the impact of progression and change for me was the Indigenous communities were formally recognised in Victoria with the latest water plan, Water for Victoria. Through collaboration and true engagement, water rights were handed back to our Indigenous communities. Victoria led the way with this first step in 2017, and it was really exciting to see it come to fruition. We've also seen the formation of the Werribee Council, which means a voice of the Yarra, with key stormwater advocates like Chris Chesterfield and Alexandra Lee there at the helm. We also have the overarching agreement that the Australian government ratified several international human rights instruments that recognise and protect Indigenous people's special connection to land and waters. A product of the government support of the UN, this ratification was a great national step in the right direction. The Healthy Waterways Strategy, and the focus of today's session, doesn't look past the needs and engagement of our Indigenous community either. Rather, it reflects on our history and then incorporates the cultural values of the traditional owners. Specifically though, the Healthy Waterways Strategy has a goal for Indigenous cultural legacies to be celebrated in a respectful and open dialogue. In each of the catchment-based strategies, Melbourne Water engaged with local Indigenous communities in collaborative sessions all over the state. So I'm really proud of our industry and its movement to reconcile the past and move forward in a much more collaborative way. Thanks again for joining us today. I look forward to hearing our speakers. Thanks, Trace.
Okay, thanks, Jamie. So the first speaker we have today is Daniel Fokins from the City of Casey. Daniel is a civil engineer who has worked in the stormwater industry for 14 years across strategic planning, design, and construction. He started his career in the private sector, but is now enjoying his time at local government with having started at the City of Casey in 2014. He is the team leader of subdivision and development engineering team, where he enjoys working between developers and the water industry to implement best practice water management. Thank you, Daniel.
Thanks, Tracy. I'll just share my screen. All right, I think we're there. So thanks, Tracy, and thanks for organising today, and for Stormwater Victoria for this two-part series, which is really great. A big thanks to Melbourne Water and the EPA for their presentations last week. It was really great to hear such a concise summary from many years of work by Melbourne Water and partner organisations to update the strategy to where we are now. It was really also really exciting to hear the work that the EPA are putting together in reviewing and improving the science behind our stormwater targets. So as Tracy said, I'm Daniel Fokins, and I currently work at the City of Casey and I'm the team leader of subdivision and development engineering, so I'll be speaking on the local government perspective today. So it's often quoted that water is life, but without water, we don't have an environment, and we don't have vegetation, and we don't have healthy waterways. And that's why I love this quote from Sylvia Earle, who's an American marine biologist, because I think it sums up what we do as an industry so well in protecting the environment for the communities to enjoy. So today I'll be speaking for the next 20 minutes on a couple of things. I want to speak about how the Healthy Waterways vision aligns quite nicely with local government objectives, the strategic objectives. Look at some of the issues and opportunities and see, give my perspective on how we can feel that as an industry. And I'll use a couple of case studies to demonstrate those opportunities. But firstly, looking at the alignment of vision. So the Healthy Waterways vision outlines that healthy waterways connect communities. They provide thriving communities for plants and animals. They provide amenity for residents and allow the community to engage with the environment. And they need to be managed sustainably. So local governments across the world strive to create livable communities. And in Victoria, we're no different. So what I wanted to do was I had a look at a couple of strategic objectives of different council plans. And starting with Casey, one of the strategic objectives of Casey is about sustainably planning and managing the diverse, manage growth while protecting our diverse landscape. Knox want to value the natural and built environment. Moreland have a strong focus on livability and sustainability in guiding growth. Kingston has a strong focus on their sustainable green environment. And Manningham like many others, are looking at ways to reduce their environmental impact. So what's livability? Well, livability is about creating great communities where people want to live, where people thrive, where people enjoy working and coming home, and where people want to spend their time on the weekends. We want to create amenity whereby our residents enjoy spending their time in their local community. And we want to create community connection, both physically and socially. And the environment plays such an important role in achieving all of the above. And as I've pointed out there, I've highlighted a couple of words between the vision and the strategic objectives of different councils. And this is the case across all local governments, but it shows how the Healthy Waterways Strategy vision and local government objectives align so nicely. So the Healthy Waterways Strategy spells out two key threats to healthy waterways, and they were urbanisation and climate change. Given my experiences in development, I'll be focusing on the urbanisation element. I'm not an expert in climate change, but urbanisation causes a change to the flow regime. Climate change means a change in rainfall and creates issues with maintaining base flows for waterways. The strategy pointed out that flows are so critical to the health of waterways and pollutants are highly variable across the catchments. So the two key actions that were outlined in the strategy were to harvest and to infiltrate. So the Healthy Waterways Strategy is the first in recent times to tackle things from a catchment perspective. It clearly identifies targets that are required to restore those waterways. And this is great, and this is what's needed in a strategy like this. But it also shows, and what I want to demonstrate today is just a couple of gaps or opportunities that I see. And I want to focus on the ability to implement those targets. So the Healthy Waterways Strategy clearly identifies the issues in each catchment and nominates priority areas. It shows the targets that are needed to restore the waterways to become healthy. But a couple of things that I wanted to point out is can those targets be achieved? Are they practical? I want to talk a little bit about the funding and the funding framework to make this happen. Enforceability, and what I mean by that is the Healthy Waterways Strategy isn't currently written into legislation, and so I want to talk about how we can make that enforceable. Some of the issues just around practicality and the alignment that we need to see between things like the Melbourne Water Developer Services Scheme and the Healthy Waterways Strategy, so that we're aiming for the same thing. And then finally, I want to look at some of the practicalities on targets. So this diagram won't be unusual to any of you here, and thanks to Chris Ross and others in 2004 with his paper Urban Stormwater and the Ecology of Streams created this diagram. And I'm not going to focus on this because we're all stormwater professionals here and we've seen this many times, but I think it's important to provide the context. Urbanisation completely changes flow regimes, and it really flips on its head what happened previously in a forested catchment, with infiltration reducing, runoff increasing, and creating much more peaky and more frequent flows to the waterways. So talking about those two key threats, we know that development has a significant impact on the environment. Urbanisation clears vegetation to make way for houses and pavements. It creates impervious surfaces which affect infiltration, change the natural flow regime, and increase pollution. To put it simply, urbanisation is the waterway's worst enemy. Local government are the planning authority, and we have a key role to play in helping achieve the vision of the strategy. So the Healthy Waterways Strategy outlined those two key threats, climate change and urbanisation. And we as an industry have the responsibility and influence to manage stormwater through urbanisation. And as you can see here from this diagram, shows what's happened in the city of Casey over the last 10 years. So what can we do about it? I want to focus on how we can implement the targets of the strategy and focusing on those four key elements as I've outlined below. So just looking at funding for a sec, funding is not the focus of my presentation today, and so I'm only going to spend a minute talking about it, but the Healthy Waterways Strategy makes it clear that a partnership approach is required in meeting the objectives, and no one can achieve this alone. And as such, there's an opportunity for supporting the delivery of the strategy through the development of a framework which clearly articulates the roles, responsibilities, and funding. The Healthy Waterways Strategy outlines the problem, the indicators, and some solutions, but it doesn't, and nor should it, outline how this will achieve. I think that's another piece of work that we are responsible for doing as a stormwater industry. Local government depend on a range of sources for funding stormwater projects in our municipalities. And it's important to remember stormwater is not the core business. It's one of the competing interests of how local governments run. And where we get our money from for doing stormwater projects is through rates, through grants, through partnering with Melbourne Water with delivering the developer services schemes, through other ideas like the developer contributions, such as what Kingston has put together, and also through planning by getting developers to do those works. So I guess the question remains, how does local government continue to be an active partner in delivering the strategy, especially when funding is being directed to priority areas? There's currently no clear partnership between the developer services scheme and the Healthy Waterways Strategy targets. And local government rates are limited and stretched across delivering the many services that we provide. As I said earlier, this is a hugely complex issue. So there are a number of strategies and targets that they're already put in place to manage urban stormwater and runoff, and which many of you here have been critical in developing over the last many years. And so in this diagram, I'm in no way trying to capture everything that has happened over the last 20 years, but I want to talk a little bit about enforceability and the role of the planning scheme in that. So many of you know in 2006, the key milestone was reached with the introduction of clause 5607 in the planning scheme, which has been a key driver for good water outcomes in development over the last 14 years. And that was based on that 99 document, best practice environmental management guidelines. Then in 2008, another key milestone was reached with the introduction of clause 5318 and some updates to the other stormwater clauses. And this has now captured a vast array of development for ensuring that there's good stormwater outcomes for development. The same year, the Healthy Waterways Strategy was updated from its 2013 version. And to date, BEPM has been our guiding document for stormwater outcomes. It has a blanket target to meet for all development to reduce the pollutant load on our waterways and bays. It's convenient, but as an industry, we've evolved in our understanding of waterway health indicators. There have been numerous studies over the recent years which show that urbanisation has a much greater impact on waterways than is just being dealt with through BEPM. And we knew the change in flow regimes was an issue. We know that environmental flows are important, but there's been an emerging narrative that there was too much flow getting to the waterway, and this is probably a much higher contributor to poor waterway health than previously thought. And although it's still important to capture nutrients, volume management has quickly become a big issue. The problem is the problem was there were no targets, and development has continued the way that it has over the last 10 years. So then enter the Healthy Waterways Strategy. This has confirmed the science about flow and volume, listing climate change and urban stormwater as the two greatest risks. And this document has been critical for us at Casey and as an industry in applying controls on the objectives of the planning scheme over the last 18 months, but it's not without its challenges. So I want to focus now on how the Healthy Waterways Strategy and planning requirements align. The Healthy Waterways Strategy has clear targets, but not currently enforceable. The planning scheme has clear objectives, but no targets, but it is enforceable. What I've got shown here through this diagram is just some of the key aspects of the Victorian planning scheme, which have stormwater objectives. So the stormwater objectives are really clear when it comes to managing stormwater. They are to minimise damage to property and the inconvenience to residents downstream, to ensure streets are designed adequately to take major flow and our pipes are designed correctly. But I guess the three main objectives that align quite nicely are to minimise increases in stormwater and protect the environmental values and physical characteristics of receiving waters by degradation from stormwater. That's a really clear alignment with the Healthy Waterways Strategy. To encourage stormwater management that maximises retention and reuse, again, a really clear alignment with the actions outlined in the Healthy Waterways Strategy. And to encourage stormwater management that contributes to cooling, local habitat improvements, and the provision of attractive and enjoyable spaces. Again, a key alignment. So we can see that the objectives align. The targets are clear in the Healthy Waterways Strategy, but no targets in the planning scheme except for what's demonstrated through BEPM. So is it as simple as just adding the Healthy Waterways Strategy targets into the planning scheme so they become enforceable? Are those targets achievable and are they practical? I think they're the big questions, and I want to explore that further over the next two case studies. So the first case study is the Kidinnia Creek South PSP, which is in the city of Casey and was gazetted in January 2019. There are 5 key developers that own land in this PSP. Recycled water is supplied and mandated in the precinct, and that's an important consideration to remember. There are integrated water management planning requirements through the PSP, the planning scheme, and these have been translated into the planning permits. It's not in a priority area of the Healthy Waterways Strategy, although it's immediately downstream of the Kidinnia Creek priority area. And as you can see in the top right-hand corner of the site, the PSP is bound by Kidinnia Creek. And it is covered by a developer services scheme. So there is a PSP requirement. There are clear planning scheme objectives. There are clear Healthy Waterways Strategy targets for this catchment. And it fits in nicely with the Integrated Water Management Forum objectives that many of you here today are a part of. So as I said before, it sits in the Westernport catchment. So as you can see, there's clear targets on what is required for harvesting and for infiltration. And that is translated to 5.5 megalitres per year per hectare of impervious area for harvesting and 1.9 megalitres per year per hectare for infiltration. So we put this to the developers to come up with a solution, and they've engaged Verve and AFOX Consulting to come up with a solution. And the solution they've come up with at the moment at its concept stage is shown there. And what we're aiming to do is irrigate 17 ovals throughout the precinct and beyond the PSP precinct. That translates into 120 megalitres a year of water that's harvested and reused through the irrigation of active open space. And quite amazingly, because of the size of the catchment and the volume of flow that's coming through there, it provides 100% reliability of stormwater supply. That's amazing because that's usually not achievable. Usually, as we know, we aim for about 80% before it becomes gets to that point of diminishing return. But because of the size of the catchment coming through here, we can achieve that 100% reliability. So how does that compare with the Healthy Waterways Strategy targets? Well, on the left there, you can see the targets, which is a per hectare target. If we translate that out or expand that out to the PSP area, that translates to just under 3 gigalitres a year that should be harvested for this catchment, and just under 1 gigalitre a year that should be infiltrated. The Moneygates project, which is the proposal I just showed you there, aims to harvest a significant amount of water, which is 123 megalitres a year. But when you compare that to the size of the catchment, it only works out to be about 12% of the target of the Healthy Waterways Strategy. So does that mean this project shouldn't proceed? Does it mean the projects should be expanded? Well, it's not in a priority area, although it aligns really nicely with the objectives of the Healthy Waterways Strategy in reducing the impact of urbanisation and through one of the key actions of harvesting. It's using water in just about every opportunity we have, keeping in mind that there's recycled water that's mandated in this precinct, so we can't use water for stormwater for toilet flushing. We can only use it on the public spaces. So recycled water is a competitor for fit for purpose water in the precinct. There aren't any opportunities in this catchment to harvest more. There isn't great opportunities to infiltrate because there aren't sort of the sub-catchment bioretention basins and those sorts of things, because it's covered by a developer services scheme and the assets are through waterways and wetlands. So there will be some losses, obviously, through those assets, and there will be some infiltration, but it's negligible. So is the target, the Healthy Waterways Strategy target, achievable? Well, in this particular case, no, it's not. But is the project practical? And is it the type of thing that we should be aiming for? Well, in my opinion, absolutely. So just to, again, looking at the project benefits, the Healthy Waterways targets are met partially. Funding is not secured, and that goes back to the complex problem I was talking about before. It is enforceable because there are objectives in the planning scheme, and we've put that into the development permits, and it's practical. It's a practical solution. The second case study I'll touch on. I won't look at in as much depth, but this is an infill development also in Casey, but this one's draining to the Dandenong catchment. The previous one was Westernport. This one's Dandenong. It doesn't have recycled water mandated for the area. It does have an integrated water management planning requirement through the planning scheme, as I outlined before, and there are some other aspects of to provide the context as written there. So why do we have a stormwater target when there's a developer services scheme here? Well, there's no volume requirement in the volume reduction requirement in the developer services scheme, but it is an objective in the planning scheme. We want to offset the impact of urbanisation as outlined in the Healthy Waterways Strategy, and we also want to diversify water supply because there's no recycled water that's mandated for this precinct. So there's no PSP requirement for it. There is a clear planning scheme objective. There is a Healthy Waterways Strategy target, although the Dandenong catchment has a much lower target for infiltration and harvesting. And it does align really nicely with the Integrated Water Management Forum objectives. So what have we got to? And thanks to Val from Stormy Water Solutions for this one. She's done the work for a high-level strategy on this project to get us to where we're at. The outcome is that there's proposal for a 2,000 litre water tank on each lot being managed by individual owners. As I said, the area doesn't have recycled water mandated, so there's an opportunity to reuse captured water in toilets, laundries and outdoor use, and that provides about an 80% reliability of supply, which is what our aim was. It results in 7 megalitres of water harvested each year, which translates to about a 26% reduction in the mean annual runoff. And this aligns really nicely. I was quite encouraged by the EPA presentation last week, which suggested that if it's not in a priority area and there isn't a clear target, then development should look to reduce their runoff by 25%. So this ticks that box. But what I want to point out is 25% is not achievable in other greenfields development where recycled water is mandated. We have the opportunity to use a lot of that water for laundries and outdoor, but where recycled water is mandated,
Hi all, thanks for that. I think we've got a situation where we've lost Daniel for a little bit here. We're going to pick that up and see what we can do with that. Trace, we haven't planned for a backup of this one. Shall we perhaps see if Daniel comes back on in a minute, see how we go? If not, maybe we move on to Georgie's presentation and pick up Daniel when he gets back. He was totally going overtime anyway. Like, we need to pull him back into line.
All right, no worries.
You want to set Georgie up for us?
Yeah, well, okay, so our second presenter today is Georgie Wettenhall. So if you have any questions for Daniel, please pop them in the Q&A panel down below the video. So Georgie has been passionate about sustainable stormwater management since she fell out of her kayak into the Yarra. I'm sure that's a very interesting story that I'll have to ask her about later on. She is interested in the use of modelling and economics to influence policy and practice. She currently works for the CRC for water sensitive cities and design flow consulting. Thank you, Georgie. You're on mute, I think.
All right. Can you hear me now?
Yes. Thanks.
Sweet. All right. Thank you, Tracy. Yeah, so what I want to focus on today is some of the things to consider when implementing what I'm referring to as flow regime standards. So that includes the standards that are within the Healthy Waterways Strategy and also in the proposed revisions to the Best Practice Environmental Management Standards guidelines, or BEPM, that Leon and Sigourney talked about last week. So I guess I just wanted to start by saying we've always, well, for a long time, we've had stormwater flow regime standards. So flood attenuation is about managing flow, and also in the existing BEPM document, there's a standard that isn't always used, but it's about managing flows that are important for the form of waterways. And both those, so what I'm calling old or existing standards, are addressing acute problems. So they're aspects of flow regime that don't happen that often but have drastic consequences when they do. And the newer standards that are in the Healthy Waterways Strategy and the revised BEPM, they're more about addressing chronic problems. So it's about managing those day-to-day flows and the impact they have on our waterways. So I just wanted to start by reflecting on monitoring versus modelling, because there are two different ways to consider flow regime, and I think there's pros and cons of both. So monitoring, I think its main strength is it's real, you're directly measuring what's happening, but the limitations of monitoring are that you can only monitor what's happening at the moment. You can't retrospectively monitor or monitor what's happening in the future. And also it can be quite expensive. And even though it's directly measuring what's happening, it does have errors and sort of field challenges to make sure your monitoring is accurate. Conversely, modelling, it can be cheaper to do at a big scale, and it can simulate future or past conditions. But the limitation of modelling is it's an indirect prediction of reality. So you can't be sure what you can do your best job to sort of make sure your modelling is as accurate as possible, but it's only ever going to be a prediction. So my sort of thoughts are that both monitoring and modelling have a really important role to play in managing flow regime. So I think if we do some strategic monitoring, of which we have some monitoring data already, but I think we would benefit from having more monitoring data that we can use to calibrate models that relate to flow regime, and also then validating the results of our modelling with some strategic monitoring. So I think they work really nicely together. So I don't think it's one or the other. I think they're both really important. So just touching on some of the challenges when doing monitoring. So there is some continuous flow monitoring data available at the moment, including on Melbourne Water's website, but a lot of the sort of routine monitoring that is done is targeting medium to high flows, and it predicts flow, well, it estimates flow usually by measuring depth and or velocity and converts that to a flow estimate. And usually those setups aren't targeted, the calibration isn't targeted at the very low flows that might be of interest in a water balance model. It's often the higher flows. So just a sort of word of warning if you're using stream flow monitoring data to try and calibrate a model. So, and there can also be, you know, that middle photo there at the bottom is some specific monitoring that was done of a stormwater drain for a project to try and determine the runoff coefficient for a catchment, but it's still not super accurate for low flows, particularly for a wide culvert like the one in the photo. So, and there are some indirect ways of getting monitoring data to use to calibrate flow regime models. So a few years ago, did some work on Albert Park Lake and wanted to create a flow regime model for the inflows into the lake. And Parks Victoria had some monitoring data of water levels in the lake, and that was really useful to check that the modelled flow regime was predicting a similar water level regime as had been monitored. At the moment, Melbourne Water records the water levels in many of their constructed wetlands that have a range of catchment characteristics, and that monitoring, the primary purpose of that monitoring is to monitor plant health and the relationship between water depths and plant health, but that is also a really useful data set that could be used to then back calibrate to check that the catchment flow regime predictions are giving similar water level regime as has been monitored. So we can be a bit creative about how we use monitoring to calibrate our models and validate them. So switching over to thinking about modelling rather than monitoring. So some of the challenges for modelling. I just want to point out that the standards in the Healthy Waterways Strategy and the revised BEPM, they're focused on what we don't want, which is a stormwater excess, rather than what we do want, which is a natural flow regime. I think there's good reason for that. So for all the standards, runoff volume is a really key metric, and Daniel talked about some of the strategies that can be used to reduce runoff volume. And urban runoff volume is dominated by runoff from impervious surfaces or hard surfaces, and we can more confidently model and predict runoff patterns from hard surfaces than we can from pervious surfaces, which are dependent on vegetation and soil and many site-specific factors. So by having targets that relate to that stormwater excess, we can more confidently model the excess and therefore more confidently demonstrate whether we're complying with the standards. In Queensland, a while back, they looked at having some flow regime standards that were related to the number of surface flow days. So that was more about the linking it to the natural flow regime, but that was trickier to model, and the sort of results were very sensitive to how you classified base flow versus surface flow, and it was essentially you could sort of game the model depending on how you defined the base flow threshold to give you significantly better or worse predictions in terms of your flow regime performance. So another modelling challenge with flow regime standards is predicting the harvesting demand. So as Daniel said, harvesting is critical to achieving the high flow regime standards in the Healthy Waterways Strategy and BEPM. And Daniel's example showed, you know, one with just rainwater tanks, another with just public realm harvesting. But to meet those higher standards, it probably requires a combination of both. And the predictions of how the system will perform is really sensitive to the assumed harvesting demand. So that's another thing you're trying to predict about what's going to happen in an unknown future. And indoor demands are relatively straightforward to predict, especially for residential developments. Typically, you would look at the number of bedrooms in the planned residential development and then convert that to a number of occupants and then estimate the demands for toilets, laundries, whatever the rainwater will be used for. Non-residential can be trickier. So if you've got a mixed-use commercial and industrial precinct, often you're planning that and doing a water strategy before you know what the tenants are going to be for particular sites. So it's hard to know what the water demand will be. So it requires some estimates, and so essentially the higher the estimated demand, the smaller the infrastructure you'll need to reduce your stormwater volume. So we need some sort of guidance to help people know what is a reasonable estimate to use for various development types. Outdoor demands for something like harvesting stormwater to irrigate an oval, that's pretty straightforward to estimate because we already irrigate a lot of ovals, so we can get a pretty accurate demand. But sometimes it's trickier, especially for private allotment outdoor use. The water use can depend on the garden area, the vegetation type, and really importantly, the occupant behaviour and whether houses are occupied or not. And so the storm calculator, which is used at the moment for some lot scale development assessments of compliance with stormwater quality standards, it excludes outdoor water demand, and that's a conservative approach because it is so hard to be certain what the outdoor demand will be on a private rainwater tank. So that might be too conservative approach if we're relying on rainwater tanks to help us meet these harvesting demands, but yeah, we need to decide what we will accept as a demand estimate. There's also the potential, so in the example Daniel showed that it was really hard to meet that 60% runoff volume standard that is proposed to include for some waterways in the new BEPM. So we might need to, what I've called novel demands, but you know, we might need more demands than we currently know of, and so it might be using water for things that we currently don't use water for. For example, you could irrigate a roof to help with cooling and also evaporate a lot of water that way. And it's not something we would currently use mains water for or whatever use mains water for, but if the objective is to lose water rather than to, you know, save money on mains water, it might change what the demands are. So as Daniel touched on, we've got more than enough alternative water sources. So we've got stormwater and rainwater. So stormwater is used to describe mixed runoff from roofs and other surfaces, whereas rainwater is typically used to describe roof runoff. We've got recycled water and groundwater. And recycled water, often the need to connect it is mandated, but I don't think the use of it is mandated. So there still is some flexibility around what people choose to use within their private site. And groundwater, it's not available everywhere, but where it is, it can be really cheap. And so it's hard to convince people to invest in rainwater or recycled water infrastructure if they've got abundant, cheap groundwater. So the challenge we've got is a challenge of abundance, not scarcity. So I think there's various options of how you could combine the various alternative water sources. So for example, at the Aqua Revo development, they have rainwater that is used for hot water and then recycled water that's used for outdoor laundry and toilets. And then another option, particularly in areas where if your recycled water is a bit salty, particularly in the west of Melbourne, using that as your primary source of water for irrigating your garden might not be great for the soil and plants. So you could have a rainwater tank that is your first port of call for water for outdoor laundry and toilets, and then instead of having a mains water backup for your rainwater tank, when your rainwater tank's empty, it switches to recycled water. So your soil and plants are not getting as frequent salty water. A third option, which is used in Hervey Bay, and I think maybe in Pakenham as well, is mixing treated stormwater with recycled water and then having a single supply pipe to developments. So the customers are getting a blend of water, and that could also work well if you've got salt constraints with your recycled water. This is really weird not being able to see the audience. So I just wanted to touch on some economic considerations, and I want to start by saying I'm not an economist, and so these opinions are formed from working with some excellent economists. So you've probably all heard of benefit cost analysis, which is commonly used to inform investment decisions. So in this analysis, you incorporate financial, social and environmental benefits and costs. And it involves a lot of estimates. So both the benefits and the costs are estimate, and there's essentially error bands on each cost benefit. And some of them you can be more certain about. So cost of rainwater tank, you know, that's something that you can estimate with reasonable accuracy. But some of the other benefits and costs might be less certain. So in the absence of quantitative standards, the questions that we try and use economics to answer along the lines of, does the benefit of reducing stormwater volume by 60% exceed the cost? So we've got to estimate all the costs and all the benefits and compare the two. Or it might be, does the net benefit of reducing stormwater volume by 60% exceed the net benefit of reducing the volume by 50%? And answering those questions can be really challenging when the inputs are uncertain. And so by having quantitative standards, I think it changes the question because you can essentially eliminate some of the factors that are the hardest to monetize. So I think it's an easier question to answer. What is the most cost-effective way to reduce stormwater volume by 60%? So essentially the standard is fixed. We want to reduce it by 60%, and then we can compare various options that can be used to achieve that standard and figure out which has the net benefit by thinking about the financial, social, and associated environmental benefits and costs. Ooh. So where and when do the standards apply? So at the moment, and this is the approach that's been used for stormwater quality standards as well, generally the need to comply with the standard is triggered by a new development, whether that be a subdivision or infill, redevelopment or new development. And so we're essentially putting the onus to pay for this waterway protection on those new developers. And I wonder if that's equitable, that those people are paying and other people are not. And also it means that we're relying on the rate of development and redevelopment to implement these changes. And so it might be a slow process to protect our waterways. It might stop us going backwards or slow us going backwards. And so I guess it depends on if we want to go forward more quickly, do we need to think about ways to spread the responsibility or reduce or changing our flow regime. Also, in infill areas, often it's just the lots or a small group of lots that are being developed. So we're missing the roads and public transport, public car parks, and other things like that are also generating a lot of stormwater. So we need to think about how we pick up all the surfaces. And also with new development, it's a point in time assessment, and we need to think about is the infrastructure that is being proposed by the developer going to be maintained, and is the behaviour they're relying on going to be sustained? Are people going to keep their rainwater tank connected to their toilet and use it for laundry, or is their pump going to break and they're going to think, oh, it's too much effort to fix it, I'll just switch to mains water? So we also need to think about what the receiving waterway is that the stormwater's flowing into. So the Healthy Waterways Strategy prioritises waterways, so it has place-based targets for flow regime. So also the type of waterway is important. So this aerial photo is of an area in Port Melbourne, and all that area drains to Port Phillip Bay directly in concrete pipes, and I suspect it'll always drain in concrete pipes. So there's no benefit to reducing the flow volume for that area. Reducing the pollutants in the flow is important for the bay, but the bay is not impacted by frequent flows, or the volume of the flows. So really what's important is that the standards are met before the stormwater enters a waterway. So essentially where it changes from concrete or plastic to a natural waterway. And the further upstream we can harvest or manage the stormwater, the purer it is. So rainwater is the cleanest runoff, and also as we go downstream, we can get other sources of water that enter stormwater pipes, whether it be wastewater, groundwater. A lot of groundwater is pumped into stormwater pipes from basements, or it might just seep into cracks in the pipes, and that can contaminate the water and limit harvesting opportunities.
Cool, 1 minute.
All right. So in terms of support for the industry, when we're introducing new standards like this, we need to make sure there's good guidance for the developers and those that need to approve development, so they know what is reasonable to assume. We need examples, which I know there are some already. And also, I think it's really important to remember that our capacity to manage flow regime will improve. So it probably all seems hard to think how we're going to do this, but the more we try, the better we'll get. And so I like reflecting. I think Tim Fletcher pointed this out to me a while back, that music didn't exist when stormwater quality standards were introduced. So it's okay for it to feel hard now, because we will get better. Thank you.
Thanks, Georgie. Yeah, I think that's really some really interesting points that you've touched on there. And I really like, especially the more demands than we currently know of now. Sounds really interesting. Like, it's an interesting space for the stormwater industry to, I guess, move outside what we're used to try and meet some of these strategies and meet some of these targets. So I will quickly flick it to Daniel to finish his presentation, because it was very interesting. Daniel, can you share your presentation? Thanks.
Sure thing. All right, sorry about that earlier. Tracy said, make sure you check your internet connection before you start. So I blame NBN because I did check. But look, I think this is where I got to before. Was just looking at this residential development in case you go into the Dandenong catchment, and looking at the summary about what this was going to achieve. And I think so. Basically, what we're looking at here is individual tanks that are supplying the toilet and laundry and used for outdoor use for each of the individual owners, and managed by individual owners. And I know that presents its challenges as well. What this results in is an 80% reliability of supply, which is really good. And then that would then switch over to mains water when that supply is not available. But it translates to quite a significant reduction in the flow from this catchment, and that results in about a 26% reduction in mean annual runoff, which I think sits nicely with the EPA presentation last week that suggested if urban development was in an area that didn't have wasn't a priority area, but looking at reducing the impact of urbanisation, then the 25% mark was probably a nice figure. But what I wanted to point out is that this 26% reduction, or the 25% reduction, may not be achievable in other greenfields areas where there's recycled water that's an option. And as Georgie pointed out, there's an abundance of fit for purpose supply options. This 26% was only achievable here because we could connect it up to those three uses. So just to wrap up, the key thing to remember is that all urbanisation impacts waterways, and a truly sustainable future means that all development manages stormwater sustainably. So it's a complex issue, and the responsibility doesn't just lie with new developers, new development, doesn't just rely on local government, doesn't just rely on Melbourne Water. But the solution requires a new approach to our business as usual. Some of the gaps that I see is we need a funding framework to clearly outline how this partnership approach will work, and we need to have some management guidelines about how that partnership approach will work as well, and especially in prioritising works and clarifying roles. We need the targets to be practical and achievable. So I think we need to make sure that the targets that are written into legislation are pragmatic, so that we can all do our bit to improve the outcomes of development on the ground and see our waterways being enjoyed by all. So that was it from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel. All right, so I want to share this one. All right, so I guess we'll be moving on to questions. Yeah, you can see that. Will the presentations be circulated afterwards? Yes, they will. We're just figuring that out, but we'll send you an email to let you know about the 2 webinars and where we've posted them. The first question is for Daniel. In order to fund stormwater asset, has local government considered an introduction of a stormwater specific levy? Or alternatively, what's your thoughts on how the stormwater utility could be used as a vehicle to manage and fund stormwater assets?
Beautiful. It's a really good question. And have we considered it? Yes, absolutely. It's something that I think that's getting a lot of traction in the industry at the moment. As I pointed out earlier in my presentation, that I didn't want to focus too much on funding because I think it requires so much more discussion, and it's a discussion that has been happening in other forums as well. But one of the key critical issues with local government is having that regular funding source. And we don't have a dedicated funding source that goes towards stormwater projects. We're fighting with our 66 other services that council provides to get a share of the rates, and then we depend very much on grants through things like Living Rivers and other possibilities. So there's been some huge traction that's happened in the industry over the last many years, and the integrated water management forums is a perfect example of that. But yeah, I think funding is one of those critical things that needs to be addressed.
So following on from that, another question we had is, what about a tax on impermeable surfaces? What do you think about that, Daniel?
Look, I went to a very memorable presentation at Stormwater Australia conference last year by Andy Rees, and I'm sure many people here today were at that presentation as well. And that talked about some of the work he's been doing in the States about putting a tax. And his catchphrase was, "The more you pave, the more you pay," and it's such a great catchphrase because it's memorable and it works. So personally, I think that would be a great outcome. That just requires some momentum from the industry to make that happen.
Great, thanks for that. Just having a look at the questions. Okay, I think this one kind of goes to Georgie. Do we need to increase yield requirements to achieve volumetric targets? For instance, at the moment we aim for 20 to 25 lots per hectare in greenfield. Daniel showed that we can get 10% to 25% of the targets at this density using our tools. If we increase to 100 lots per hectare, we could achieve a higher potable demand.
Yeah, so and the CRC for water sensitive cities have done some really good work on infill development. So essentially, if we can increase the demand to roof area, it's much easier to meet the demand with cheaper infrastructure. And similarly, but harvesting roof runoff is only part of the picture, and so then we've got to think about how can we increase the demands for non-roof runoff and make sure we've got a big enough demand. And that's where, and Belinda Hatt's done some really good work on whether we can use stormwater to irrigate ballast on railways to help stop tracks warping in warm weather, or so it's like how can we hunt down some extra demands for this surplus of water that we've got.
So yeah, that really touches on your conclusion about thinking of other ways to use water that we maybe haven't thought of previously. Okay, I think that will be the end of the question and answer session. Now, if we have any more questions, feel free to ask them and I'll direct them to the panelists so that they can answer that after the session. I've just got a few closing remarks. Upcoming events. So we've got a few socially distant events coming up. Next Thursday, we have our networking water drinks with Clearwater. It's going to be over Zoom. The event will be sponsored and hosted by facilitation experts Ross Allen, who's 3 Seeds Agency, and Simone Mouse Collective Insight, who will give their 5 golden rules for creating engaging online events. Sounds super interesting. There will be ISO fashion parade and of course prizes. So that's next Thursday on June 4th from 4:30 to 5:30 p.m. So register with Clearwater. While we're on the topic of Clearwater, they're running a really cool event on the 16th of June, collaboration and facilitation in the new online space and how to keep audience engaged and energized. So check that out. From an SV point of view, we've got a seminar lined up for July, like another webinar. It'll be about smart technology, talking tanks for water conservation, flood management, and environmental base flow. So have a look and check those out, and we'll send you emails about them. Also, please have a look out for webinars from other states. So I know Stormwater Queensland and Stormwater New South Wales have been putting out a lot of various webinars. So have a look at that, and then to get a perspective that's a bit broader than Victoria. If you have any suggestions for future topics, please fill out the survey at the end of this webinar and let us know. Speaker gifts and donation will be donations to WaterAid Australia. That goes towards getting clean water and facilities to communities that currently don't have them. So thank you again, Georgie and Daniel, for those excellent presentations. So very interesting. And yeah, thanks also to Jess and Gems and Contessa for organising and putting this fantastic webinar together. All right, thank you all. Have a good afternoon.